How many versions of events do we have for the day that Jesus was crucified? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. Today, we are going to be walking through the 4 different versions of Jesus' crucifixion that we see in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. That's the order we're going to go through them, starting with Mark, the earliest version that we have, and walking our way along to see where these different texts agree and disagree. Because, spoiler alert, they don't all agree about the events of this day. Despite the importance of this day for the messages of the gospel, they're not on quite the same page. And we're going to talk about why. We're going to get into the details of each gospel, where they walk away from each other, where they agree with each other, some of the background that might be coming through in this. We walk through a wide variety of these kinds of questions. It's a little bit of a longer episode, but I think it's worth your while, especially if you've ever had a question about why John maybe doesn't agree with Mark. Remember, for early access to ad-free video versions of the podcast and exclusive bonus content, you can join us on Patreon. We're Bible and Arc on Patreon. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the last day of Jesus. Bob, we have a big topic for today leading into Easter.
Right.
We're going to be going through the events of Good Friday. Not the whole Passion Week, not everything that comes after, because there's too much to go through in all of this. But given the importance of this day for all 4 Gospels, we thought it was worthwhile to walk through what's happening on Jesus's last day.
Right.
Well, maybe his last day, depending on what you think happens after this day, right? So maybe last day part 1. But why the Gospels come to this in some different ways, in agreement or disagreement at times, to walk through. We're going to go through each of them rather than just picking one. Right. And rather than flattening them all together. So I guess for you, why go this way, or should we be going about it another way?
Well, this is an interesting topic because it's the last day of Jesus. It's like the day of his trial. It's the day of his arrest. It's the day that leads up to his crucifixion. And one would think that because there were disciples there, some of them hiding, some of them running away, but because you have 4 accounts of it, you would think that of all of the days, especially with his crucifixion, of all of the days that you have like witnesses and a historically accurate,
eyewitness testimony, right?
Here it is. We know what happens. It's a public event, right? We can hear Pilate. We can see what's going on. We can hear, because this is such a public event, one would assume that this would be the this would be the event that you would have the most parallel, the most corroborated stories in the Gospels. But what it turns out is it's not necessarily the case. The Gospels and the Gospel authors tell different stories. They highlight different things, not just highlighting this and leaving this out and highlighting this and maybe leaving this out. But I don't want to say they contradict,
but at times
they tell different and emphasize different things, which at times differ. They're hard to reconcile with each other. So instead of saying they contradict, let's read them one at a time and see what each gospel author is trying to emphasize.
And I think we have to say up front, right, as we're approaching all of these, I'm sure someone already in the comments talking about either side of approaching this as an eyewitness testimony, whether you're saying, well, if they're eyewitnesses, they should all agree. Or people will counter and say, no, they're eyewitnesses that are all different perspectives, and so they should disagree. And that's a point where people always debate and come through. So if you're leaving that comment, we know that there are different approaches to this, different perspectives on this. As we're going through all of them, though, that's where we want to spend the time of when they are going one way or another.
Right.
Are there threads that we can pull on to help identify underlying causes that might be coming out, some of the context of what they are talking about, or the concerns that might be coming out within this? Because these are things, if you're looking at these as an editor coming to this text later and you go, this is a big day, and you're supposed to all have been seeing the same thing, why don't we fix this, right? That's a question of why doesn't someone come in and say, you don't agree. Mark, you don't agree with Matthew, you don't agree. Well, why don't we fix that and make sure everyone says the same thing?
Correct.
If nowhere else, right here. Why doesn't that happen?
And to their credit, they didn't do that for the most part. They did it in some places, like at the end of the Gospel of Mark, right? But for the most part, they left these Gospels to say their individual things, their different things. Now, there is evidence that they harmonized across certain Gospels, but for the most part, they allowed them to say the same. Let me say one other thing. One of the apologetic stories that I've always heard was, no, they're different eyewitnesses, like somebody who witnesses a car accident in an intersection, right? And this guy is going to say, no, I saw, that brown sedan, he ran the red light. And somebody else will say, no, the green pickup truck, he ran the red light. And it's just a difference of opinion, and they both have their own truths, and they both can be true. But, is one actually true and the other one not true? Or can both of them have a difference of opinion? And we didn't have a surveillance camera. So that's a nice analogy, right? This guy thought he was through the intersection, and this guy thought that guy was turning. But that's not really what's happening here, right? This is more of were there 3 cars in the intersection, or were there 5 cars in the intersection? Or was there just 1 car in the intersection?
Yes.
And was the car white, or was it orange? Or was there no car? And was there an intersection, right? This is what we're talking about. The differences in some of these gospel accounts are pretty big.
Yeah.
And other times they're these little ones. And so instead of trying to harmonize them all together, we want to look at them individually and see what these individual gospel accounts say. And then we can begin to answer the question of why they weren't editing these discrepancies, these differences away. And I think we'll get to the answer of, because they wanted to let these gospel authors speak. They were each trying to say something different. And those differences, those different audiences, what they were trying to say to them was more important than getting them all aligned to say the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start then with Mark. We're not going to go from Matthew. Sure. We're going to backtrack to what gets commonly pointed to as
gospel written.
The one that could have been the source text or in front of someone, or right. There's all those kinds of debates. We're going to start with Mark.
The first gospel written.
And who is Mark working off of? If you, again, look back to Dr. Baker's conversations of, are there other influences that might be adhered? We're not going down that path. Right. Starting with Mark, and we're going to kind of break it into scenes, I think is a helpful way to, if we're acting like this is a TV show or a movie, there are these distinct moments along this storyline, because it's a long day to work through. So if we're breaking it into moments, can we start with the bringing about of the sentencing and that first scene with Pilate? So this is after Jesus, right? We're starting in Mark 15. The chief priests, right? They are doing their questioning here. They take Jesus to Pilate. And we get this initial conversation scene between Jesus and Pilate, where in Mark, Pilate's doing the questioning, have you no answer? You see the charges that they have. And we have this Jesus that makes no further reply. We have our silent Jesus. And the questioning of, are you king of the Jews? And Jesus' answer is, in verse 2, you say so. So why does Mark, for us, start here? Can we talk about the characters of the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, the council, Pilate? What's going on with this group?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to remember that by this time, the Romans were in charge. And we always just, we just kind of throw that away. The Romans are the only ones that could pass a death sentence. The Romans were the only ones that could do this. So even though it's the high priest and it's Jerusalem, and if they wanted to accuse Jesus of blasphemy, which it's a thought crime today, right? You're claiming to be God, or you're claiming to be, you're violating the precepts of a religious tradition. In a country today where we have freedom of religion, it's just a thought crime. You're thinking the wrong thing about a religion, or you're saying something about a religion that's false. In some countries today, you can get killed for that. In our country, in theory, you're not supposed to be able to be punished for that. But back then, that was a capital offense. But only the Romans could carry out a sentencing for a capital offense. So they had to bring him to Pilate. So that's why they're doing this.
Which isn't a detail that Mark gives us.
Right.
It's something we see showing up in
Right.
some others.
It's just an assumed thing.
Yeah.
They're bringing him before Pilate. And what we get is this silent Jesus. And you see this a lot in Mark. So Mark, everything's very quick, right? Immediately, if you ever go through Mark. But the other thing that we get from Jesus is he doesn't say a lot. He takes this very quiet approach. And so you get this immediately, and then scenes just cut from one to another, and then silence is the coin of the realm. In fact, we mentioned this in the open, the Gospel of Mark originally ends with chapter 16, verse 8. The women go to the tomb, they see that it's open, and they were afraid. Curtain down, cut to black. You've got Journey, what is it? Don't Stop Believing, whatever it was. And the bell rings at the end of The Sopranos, right? And then it goes to black, and you don't know what happens. And this is the way that Mark originally ended, because they wanted the reader to be like, well, I'm afraid too. I don't know what to believe. What am I going to choose to do? That was a conscious decision by the author. Now, later on, they're like, yeah, but all these other gospels have these resurrection.
It's not really a satisfying end.
It's not. And people complained about the end of Sopranos as well. So, but that was one of the features of the gospel, right? It's silent. It makes the reader decide. And so Jesus is sitting there being silent. Are you the king of the Jews? Well, but you're saying that, not me. And then they keep peppering in these questions, and Jesus just sits there stoically, right? Silently. And it drives them mad, but he's not incriminating. This is the original Fifth Amendment, right? He's just not saying anything. And Pilate's like, okay, well, I don't hear any crime.
Well, and I do think it's worth pointing out here between verse 2 and 3, right? Pilate does this first question, are you king of the Jews? Verse 3 then is, then the chief priests accused him of many other things. I feel like a lot of times the assumption coming into this is, well, Pilate, being the one that they bring him to, is doing the questioning in Mark. But Mark, out of this group, we get a question to Pilate, and then a shift in focus for who is doing the questioning, which leads us into, okay, as Pilate's doing this, I'm not really seeing what's going on here when we get to that Barabbas question. That in that moment, I think the importance of them being the ones in Mark's account that are doing this questioning comes back up, because they are then stirring the crowd in verse 11 to have the release of Barabbas. So you mentioned that Rome is in charge, but why, if Rome is in charge, right? They can't execute the death sentence, they say in other gospels. What's the role that they are trying to, why bring him to Pilate? Why are they trying to stir things up? Why are they the ones doing the accusations?
Apparently, we have this tradition of the release of Barabbas, right? And according to this story, according to the account, they release Barabbas. Now, you have this detail that the priests were going around trying to get the crowd to cheer for the release of Barabbas.
Give us Barabbas.
And not for Jesus, which means that either they were trying to take advantage of this situation, this tradition that Pilate was trying to use to say, look, I don't want to condemn this guy. He hasn't said anything that violates Roman law,
right?
So he might violate your, Jewish tradition, but that's not a death sentence under Rome, worthy of a death sentence under Roman law. So he hasn't done anything to us. And then they start accusing him some more, and Pilate's like, I'm not going to punish him for that, but he's looking for a way out. Pilate is, and if you go back and read Josephus, Pilate's already at odds with the Jewish high command here, right? Jewish Pilate, when he came in, he tried to exert his power, and the Jewish people kind of called his bluff, and he had to back down, and he's been embarrassed about that ever since, right? This is when they brought
bring their necks out, and
they said, I'm going to kill you all. And they just showed their necks and said, then do it. And he realizes, oh crap. And then later on, when they were building the waterways, the aqueducts, he had them, had them beaten pretty good with undercover soldiers out there. And so there's this tension of, am I going to start a riot? Do I need to beat these guys? And the chief priests, They realize that Pilate is kind of weak. He has the power, but he's also compromised. By the way, there's some things going on back in Rome that kind of undermine Pilate's security as well.
Mhm.
So Pilate doesn't want these guys to go tattling back to Rome because he's not sure. So there's this balance. There's this very delicate balance between Pilate and the chief priest and the Jewish establishment, the religious establishment. And so he wants to let Jesus go, but he doesn't just want to defy the Jewish high priesthood, according to the story. And so he's like, well, let's use this tradition. Clearly, you don't want to let this, and it was basically an insurrectionist. Barabbas.
Right. Well, and that's what Mark tells us, is that, because we get Barabbas is one of these details where who exactly is this individual? Mark, he's in prison with the rebels who'd committed murder during the insurrection. So that's the Barabbas we get in Mark, which I do think, given the context from Josephus that you mentioned, and then who is Barabbas? And then if we look down at verse 15, Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them after flogging Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Because the background context, if we're just looking at 15, I do think it's fair to come away with this with some questions of, why are they driving the way that they are? Why is Pilate scared of the crowd? Why is Pilate reluctant to have an individual crucified? Because Josephus, he says Pilate has some difficulties with rebels. He also tells us about a Pilate who doesn't care at times as well, and just, I'm going to do what I want to do. So which version of Pilate, or is it both, that we see struggling with this scene in Mark?
According to Josephus, Pilate had a benefactor back in Rome who was responsible. It was an advisor to Tiberius, the emperor, who was responsible for helping Pilate get his position. Remember, Pilate was equestrian class, so he was working his way up. And basically, they put you out in Judea, they put you out in Jerusalem to say, all right, if you can handle this here, then we'll promote you later on. So he had some help with Tiberius back in Rome. But that advisor back in Rome was also accused of treason or betraying, and he was executed. So now Pilate doesn't have that cover that he used to have back in Rome. So Pilate's not sure, if these guys go complaining, I might have a problem. Josephus also tells us that Pilate really didn't care about the hoi polloi of Jerusalem. So at the end of the day, Pilate doesn't see Jesus as some special messiah. He's just like, if you guys say you want to kill this guy, fine, but I don't see anything wrong with him. So here's this horrible person. Who should I release? And Pilate's clearly, they're not going to elect to this guy who's a murderer versus this guy who's going around preaching nice things, love your enemy. And but apparently, according to the text, it's the Jewish authorities that are, arousing the crowd to say, release Barabbas. Which, and then we have this conversation about, is this elements of anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, people will say, insertions, and not insertions, but into the text, traditions into the text to make the Jewish people, or at least the Jewish religious leadership, look, I don't want to say anti-Christian, but anti-Jesus at the time. But for whatever reason, according to the story, they choose Barabbas, and Barabbas is the one that's released, and Pilate's like, okay, I don't care. Kill the guy.
Yeah.
Right? I tried. You saw me. I tried to let this guy go. I don't care, but he's pretty innocent. But okay, that's who you want to kill? Fine.
And I do think that line of his trying to get out of it, and the responsibility of the role, where does responsibility fall according to the gospel that you're reading, is one of these developments that changes over time, that when you're reading the harmonized version or you're seeing the harmonization in a movie, can flatten it out to one thing. But how much are they trying to get Pilate off the hook? Which is an interesting move, given his role as this Roman authority figure, that this is the person, it seems like the perfect baddie, but you might be trying to free him up from responsibility.
At the end of the day, Pilate can just say, yeah, kill him. I mean, if he really didn't care, he could just say, this is the guy you want me to execute? Okay, fine.
Which is what we end up with in John, which is that I'm the one who can crucify you or save.
Correct. But here, you seem to have a little bit more of the tension between the Jewish religious authorities with whom Pilate has to work.
Yeah.
And Pilate, who seems to be aware that these guys do have some power. He has to work in tandem with them because they can always do what they did before and send a letter of complaint back to Rome. And he, according to Josephus, no longer has this support that he used to have, this benefactor that he had that was always in Tiberius's ear talking up Pilate.
Yeah.
And so he can't just tell these guys to go fly a kite, and he can't just put people to death like he used to, just crucify people, because that gets him accused of being too rough. So he's trying to walk a fine line. And so this actually is a pretty, I think, decent attempt to articulate the tension between the Jewish religious authorities and Pilate.
And the crowd. I think the role of the crowd here too, because he's both scared of maybe that letter coming out, but also knowing, right, Barabbas is in prison for being a part of an insurrection.
Right.
We have these other stories of the people rising up here that if the authorities are capable of getting this crowd together to say, give us this guy, if I go against you, what else are they capable of getting this crowd to do in the situation that's going to come? So Pilate hands Jesus over, right? If we kind of fast forward through here, we have the mocking scene with where we get the crown of thorns coming in, the hail the king of the Jews. I want to fast forward us a little bit to the moment of the crucifixion, which we get down in Mark 15:25 is when this starts. Because this scene here with the two bandits is, again, we're playing the movie version of this out, a famous moment in this. But one of the moments that becomes a moment of distinction between the accounts that we have. Because in Mark, we get, he's crucified with two bandits, one on his right, one on his left. And that's the picture that you see. That's the flyer you get for the church event for Easter. But when we go through this and the mockery that happens of Jesus, in verse 32, we're told that those who were crucified with him also taunt him. We don't get the bandit, the criminal who's apologetic. Why is that left out of Mark?
I think there's a couple of things at play here. If I remember correctly, Mark is also the gospel that says two other bandits or two other criminals were crucified with him. If we read the Greek correctly, if I'm remembering back to Professor Chestnut back at Pepperdine when I was there, showing this to me, that if we look at Mark, it says, and two other criminals that were executed with him or crucified with him. And by the time you get to Matthew and Luke, they don't like that language at all because it implies that Jesus is a criminal. Two other criminals implies that Jesus is a criminal. And he's perfect. He's sinless. He can't be a criminal. So the Greek is changed in Matthew and Luke to say two others, criminals, were it's something to that effect. And I think what you've got here is the remnants of that. There was just this acknowledgement that there were two other criminals that were there on the cross who were mocking him. There were two other people because crucifixion was the lowest form of punishment. It was a deterrent. You crucified slaves and insurrectionists. It was a public, humiliating form of execution. And it was for people that you wanted to make an example of. And so you put them at the city gates, just outside the city gates. So people coming in would be, instead of saying, welcome to Las Vegas, you put this out there and it's like, this is what we do to people who mess around in the city. So don't mess around in the city.
It's a different kind of welcome.
Yeah, it's a different. It's not the one you want to stand and, have your picture taken in front of them, right? So this is what they were doing. And this is our earliest gospel. And so it's like, and there were these two other guys who were making fun of him too.
Yeah.
So it's before they're going in to try to clean it up and to, oh, no, there was one guy who actually believed in him. They're just, it's the quick, dirty, there were two other guys who were taunting him. Everybody's taunting him. And among that crowd is the chief priests, the scribes, they're mocking, and they're doing this call, let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. And those who are crucified taunt him as well. So there's this crowd. Maybe they're not taking their photo with the welcome sign coming in, but there's definitely people there because crucifixion was this very visible public event. Two criminals, two robbers, two bandits, two, however you want to translate that, being crucified with. And then we get the death. So Jesus, the two, there's the mockery that's happening. A silent Jesus in this scene when we're on the cross, right? We're in Mark still. I do think it's
at this moment, we still have some silent Jesus until we get the cry in Mark 15:34.
Yeah, I mean, we always hear these. I grew up listening to these sermons about, what is it, the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross, or some 8 and whatever it was, that Jesus said all these things. And then I go to read the Gospel of Mark, and I'm like, it's a silent Jesus. Mark maintains this theme of Jesus doesn't say much, right? So he quotes Psalm 22, or at least the Targum of it. He quotes the Aramaic version of it, right? Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? This, which is the Aramaic version of, it's the equivalent of, you can't quote the entire Psalm. Psalm 22, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far from me? Where'd you go? How did I end up here, right? And you're mad, you're angry, you're confused, and I always said it's like the equivalent of just saying Amazing Grace, when what you want to do is sing the whole song, but you're just saying Amazing Grace, when you're just amazed at how lucky you are, and you just say those 2 words, but everybody knows that what you're implying is the whole song. And that's what he's doing. He's saying these words, and they're not original, they're from Psalm 22. Right. But he's saying, he's harnessing the entire power of especially the first half of Psalm 22 by just saying these words. And then he cries, and he just screams, or he lets out this exasperated cry, and that's it. So hey, God, where'd you go? Why'd you abandon me? And then he cries out, and that's it. He's gone. So there wasn't a lot of talk from this guy. He's a silent Jesus in the Gospel of Mark.
Which, again, we'll keep it in your pocket,
right,
because we'll come back to other versions of this. So as we're laying these things out, these are kind of the highlights from each of these scenes, some of which line up with what you might expect, and other times maybe not. Because as you said, he cries out. We get last breath in 37. The temple, the curtain of the temple is torn. The centurion who says, truly this man was God's son, or the Son of God.
And this is an important point. This is a literary device that's used in every culture, and it's used to this day. You always get someone who is in the opposing party, in the opposition, to testify on your behalf. So who's the person who pronounces that Jesus was the Son of God? A Roman centurion, a Roman soldier, right? We do this in political conventions all the time. Every Democratic convention, they get some former Republican to come up and endorse the Democratic candidate, right? And every Republican convention, they get some former Democrat. You always get someone from the opposite party to come up and say, yeah, I know I used to be with them, but this guy is the real deal, right? This has been going on for a couple thousand years, right? You always get someone from the opposing side to make this declaration. And here you have a Roman soldier.
Yeah. So the centurion, truly this man was God's son. Jesus is dead on the cross. Scene almost over, because then as we continue on, to wrap us up, we have the individuals who are there, Mary, right? So we have this group that's with him, and then Joseph of Arimathea comes in, a respected member of the council who, according to Mark, himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went and asked Pilate for the body, and Pilate wondered if he were already dead. Summoning the centurion, asked him whether he had been dead for some time, and he says yes, and Joseph of Arimathea becomes the individual that then gets the body and gets to bury Jesus.
We have to assume, if he's on the council, right, if he's a respected member on the council, and this council was probably part of the group that basically encouraged Jesus, or was part of that group that was wanting Jesus, maybe he felt remorse, maybe he reluctantly went along with this, but now he's like, I feel bad. Let's at least give him a respectable burial. And so he goes to Pilate and wants the body. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, is he going to get in trouble for this, right? Is this something that, let's say the chief priests wanted to happen, or did they want him sitting up there?
Which this is one of those difference moments when we're coming to these of how do these events play out. I think too, that line, he's a respected member of the council who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. What does that mean?
Right.
Because does that mean that Joseph of Arimathea is a follower of Jesus? Right. Does that mean that Joseph of Arimathea is a part of the people at this time who are expecting a Messiah? how invested in this individual or this community group is him. Mark's version is short.
Right.
It's quick. That's the first one that we have. In, out, and we're moving on.
It's good. He's being a good teacher. He's asking the questions, and if you're the reader, you're like, oh, that's a good question. I'll have to think about it. And because in just a minute the curtain's going to come down, and you're going to have to answer all these questions. Wow, I have got to make some choices about what I believe, which is the whole point of the gospel. The whole point of the Gospel of Mark is to tell you the story, and then you have to decide what you believe for yourself.
Yeah.
That's a powerful gospel, but it's not necessarily the gospel that won out the day. It's not the whole, let me tell you what you should believe and let me tell you what people went on. It's a gospel that's inviting you to think. It's inviting you to learn. And people say, oh, it's the most poorly written gospel. And this is a powerful gospel.
Yeah. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of Jesus, the end of 15 here, they see where the body is laid, which for Mark, important for what's going to come up with where they go. But that's the end of the last day.
Correct.
For Jesus. From the going
pre-resurrection.
Pre-resurrection, right? The end of this day, from being brought to Pilate, the trial scene, crucifixion, and death.
Right.
So if we rewind the clock now.
Okay. So now,
and let's move to Matthew.
Curtain back up.
We jump into Matthew's version. So we had Mark, we've walked our way through. And then we go to Matthew. Mm-hmm. Matthew opens similarly with the chief priests, right? They do this presentation to Pilate.
Right.
That there's going to be the questioning. And then in verse 3, we get material that seemingly, if I'm reading Mark's version, I would have really liked to have known. Because there's a scene with Judas that shows up here.
Who? Yeah, where was this guy? Yeah.
So in Matthew, this is the version where Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, he repents. Goes back and tries to give the silver back. He throws it down. He goes and he hangs himself. The priests say we can't take the money, and they buy a field with it.
Right.
Why does Judas make this reappearance for Matthew's version in this moment? In this day that's focused on Jesus, Judas played a really important role in this, but why fit this right back in here?
Isn't it interesting that Judas is known as the great betrayer, right? His name is synonymous with, with betrayal. And yet, he is also the one who recognizes what he's done and does repent. He not only does he repent, he goes and tries to give back the money while Jesus is still alive.
Yeah.
So he's no. What I did was wrong. Or maybe it was a situation where, hey, you told me that if I showed you where he was, that you were going to do X, but now I realize
you're doing
something more so here's your money. I'm not going to be a part of this, but whatever the reason, Judas is remorseful to the point where, according to the Gospel of Matthew, he goes out and hangs himself. And then you have this discrepancy with the book of Acts, right? Of how he actually dies. But you do have in Matthew, Judas, after betraying Jesus once, repents while he's still alive and gives the money back.
And we get a line in verse 9, which I think is, why does Matthew bring this back in, right? The gospel authors work in different ways.
Right.
And Matthew gives us this line in verse 9, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah regarding the 30 pieces of silver and the setting of the price. So does this scene come back in? Is it possible the scene comes back in just to shoehorn in the look, Jesus has fulfilled a prophecy? Does the scene come in because of a concern for Judas? Does the scene serve a different purpose?
If I remember correctly, that prophecy isn't necessarily about the betrayal of Jesus and 30 pieces. It's just a reference to 30 pieces of silver. It has nothing necessarily to do with this prediction. It's just a reference to 30 pieces of silver. By the way, this is often what Matthew does with prophecy. Matthew tries to, and I like this word shoehorn, he tries to shoehorn in as many references from the Hebrew scriptures as he can. Sometimes they're forced. They're not even, one of them, very famously, is nowhere found. As the prophet says, and he quotes this prophecy that is nowhere to be found in the Hebrew Bible. So Matthew is trying to take not only prophecies that are established as messianic prophecies, but he's taking any reference he can find whatsoever and saying, see, just like it predicted over here, 30 pieces of silver. And it's like, yeah, but that, if you go back and read it, that's not what this is talking about. I mean, yes, it says 30 pieces of silver, but it has nothing to do with the betrayal of the Messiah.
Well, but if you understand.
Correct. And he does that a lot. So you're going to get a lot of that in Matthew. So maybe this story of the 30 pieces of silver is, I don't want to say Matthew made it up, but it's certainly something that he wanted to highlight.
Yeah. It fits in with the purposes he sees as an author of what he needs to do. Correct. Because the Judas apologetic, I think, is a surprising element of not the person you expect to get the repentance scene for, or it can come as a little bit of a surprise within the narrative. Especially
when we look at what Peter's going to do, not once, but 3 times, and never does, until the resurrected Jesus, never does get to say, I'm sorry, right?
Yeah.
Never does get to repent.
And doesn't get the reputation.
Correct. Right. Peter becomes the head of the church.
Yeah, you're the rock.
Right.
So we get a significant difference here with the Judas apologetic scene, the Judas repentance scene. Comparing to Mark, right? That's a significant change that we have. Right. We then jump back to the scene of the questioning, because Matthew had kind of positioned us with, oh yeah, they're going to go and question Jesus. And by the way, as this is happening, Judas is over here doing this.
Right.
Okay, now scene cut. We're going to go back and Pilate is doing the accusations. The chief priests are there again, giving questions, and we get a silent Jesus again in Matthew. So very similar to Mark with what we have. Then leading into our Barabbas moment again, where Pilate goes out. This time it's the notorious prisoner,
right?
Jesus Barabbas. And Pilate comes says, and who do you want? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Messiah? For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they handed him over. And then this line too, I want to add in as we go. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him.
Yeah, where'd this dream come from? Where did this wife come from? And, as you know, Roman leaders are notorious for listening to their wives when making I mean, this seems, I don't want to say concocted, but it seems like, why would an author include so many little mini stories that seem to want to remove Pilate from responsibility from the death of Jesus?
Yes.
Why are these in there? They're not in, we don't have it in Mark, right? But it's out of jealousy that these Jewish leaders handed him over. And what evil has he done in verse 13? I don't see anything wrong with this guy. And his wife comes out, Mrs. Pilate, and says, don't have anything
There's
to
a
do with
dream,
him, right? And remember, they did take dreams very seriously.
Right.
We know that. So if something happens in a dream, that's a message from the gods or from God. And so, or some kind of omen. And then finally he comes out and he says, look, this is you. This is all on you. I have nothing to do. I'm washing my hands.
Yes.
And then you have this highly problematic line in verse 24 and verse 25. His blood be on us and on our children, which has been pointed out.
From the mouths of the people. This is
mouths of the people.
In Pilate's response to, I think you're jealous, which is, we get that in Mark. He says, I think y'all are jealous of this individual. The dream comes in. But Mark had our one version where the chief priests are stirring up the people. Now in Matthew, is this kind of turning up the heat on the same depiction of the crowd as being responsible, or is this trying to work in a different way?
You've got a couple of arguments. One is that Matthew's turning it up. No, it's our fault. If anything goes wrong, it's on us. Or you've got that this is part of that, as I mentioned earlier, that anti-Christian, anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic coming from later that was added into the text. A lot of people think that this is his blood be on us and on our children. It's certainly a verse that comes to be used by anti-Semitic individuals as an excuse for punishing the Jewish people as an ethnicity, as a people, or as a group of believers for anything right? You were the people the Christ killers, right? You were the people who killed Jesus. And as our holy book says, his blood be on us and our children. Therefore, you stand condemned for what you did to Jesus. And not just that generation, right? And on our children. So from here on out, the Jews will be the scapegoats for anything that goes wrong. So this verse has been highly problematic as a license for anti-Semitism for the last couple thousand years. And the question is, was it added to the text by anti-Semitic individuals, church fathers, editors, redactors, or is this original to Matthew?
And in the question of, again, who is it trying to portray as responsible? Who is it casting as the hand? Pilate in Matthew does the hand washing.
Right.
I am removed from this individual. I didn't want to. I think you're jealous. The dream told me not to. I'm trying to get him out here.
Right.
I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.
Regardless of whether it's Matthew or whether it's a later edition, why do you think that they're trying to make Pilate so innocent and the Jewish people, the people who were responsible for the death of Jesus?
I think you have to ask the question of the concern between the community and the Roman powers, of who, if you're coming in here and your origin story is based on you, Rome, killed our guy,
right,
and we hold you responsible, that can be a power play you may not want to have versus punching against an internal group if you are seen as similar
right,
or emerging out of to distinguish yourself.
Right.
And especially when, if you're looking down the road.
Right.
If Constantine's coming in here and this becoming a part of official religion, is it helpful if, what do you know, Rome isn't the baddie in the moment of the crucifixion of Jesus?
This is another concern, and I look at this one strongly as well. Who are you trying to convert? Right? Who are you ministering to? You've had a long time, all of the early Christians were Jewish individuals, right? So there they were. Jesus is Jewish. All the early disciples were Jewish. And by this time, again, we think, if we accept that Jesus existed, we're just granting all of these things. If all this was taking place, they knew of this. They have so who are you trying to convert to this new religion? This once Christianity and Judaism begin to separate, especially after the destruction of the temple. Again, I've said this before, whether or not you're a mythicist and you posit that he existed or not, you can certainly grant that there was a tradition that was developing, that was beginning to separate and distinguish itself from Judaism.
Yeah.
So once that's happening, right, and you're trying to get Christianity to be adopted, maybe by Jewish individuals, but certainly by Romans, and you want Romans to adopt this, are they more likely or less likely to adopt this if they're the ones that killed your guy? Or if, no, you were innocent, it was these Jewish guys who did this? I think that has a lot to do with why these pronouncements, no, it's our fault. It's not Rome's fault. It's our start appearing in the gospel.
And it's similar to the scene of the centurion where Pilate, standing in here saying, I can recognize innocence. I can recognize there's nothing going on here. I'm really trying to get him out of this situation. And the people, according to Matthew, are the ones that are dedicated to the crucifixion. And
it's the Romans who say, oh, this guy is the Son of God.
Yeah.
Whereas the text depict the Jewish peoples who are rejecting Jesus as, no, we're going to kill him. The way in which it's portrayed is trying to say something by the gospel authors. But then the things that may have been added to the text, and certainly the way that this is interpreted and amplified over the years, is the roots of what would become anti-Semitism over the last couple thousand years.
So Jesus is handed over to be crucified. We have the similar scene where Jesus is taken and the crown of thorns, Hail King of the Jews. Mm-hmm. We get to the moment of the crucifixion. Simon of Cyrene, as in Mark, is compelled to carry the cross. Mm-hmm. They go to Golgotha, crucified with two bandits, one on his right, one on his left, as we had in Mark. Mm-hmm. They are similarly silent, but participating in the taunting that we had, as like with Mark, where the scribes and the elders are here. Mm-hmm. And then we get to one of our moments of difference. Because Jesus cries out in Matthew. He has the same cry of the psalm, why have you forsaken me? The people say, we think he's crying out to Elijah. And then these verses in 52 and 53, where at the moment the temple curtain was torn The earth shook, the rocks were split, the tombs were also opened, and the bodies of many saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. I think if we're looking at, information from Matthew, if you go, well, the Judas scene, not that big of a deal if Mark wants to leave that part out. Matthew's telling us that there's a bunch of people that get resurrected. Mark, it seems like that's a detail we would have liked to have known.
I would have liked to know it. In fact, I want to know what they said. I've always said this when they raised Lazarus. Where's the gospel of Lazarus? I want to, it's Jesus' best friend, right? In Islam, Muhammad's best friends are right there with him, and they're recounting, and they're the ones that become the leaders, and they're the ones. Apparently, Lazarus is Jesus' best friend, and he pulls him back from the dead. He's crying when this guy dies. Where's his testimony? I want to know where these guys' testimony is. They appeared to many. Many of them. I would like to know, because there's always this, what happens when you die? Do you get raised from the dead, or does your spirit go off and is it judged, right? Is it in paradise immediately? You could have had some pretty good answers. What happens when you die? What is resurrection like? There's the testimony. Nothing. Completely silence, which makes us ask the question, is this unique to Matthew because Matthew created it, or is it something that only Matthew knew about? And so he's reporting it still. If that's the case.
If Matthew's the only one who knew about it, then it's a hard time for them to appear to everyone.
Correct. If everyone appeared about it, I would imagine that there's some talk in the city. By the way, Josephus doesn't mention this either.
It's a detail that you would think would make its way into traditions. And we still get after this, the centurion doing the truly this man was God's son.
Right.
But in Matthew, the version is a little bit different than in Mark. In Mark, if we look back, it's the centurion saw that in this way he breathed his last, and he said, truly this man was God's son. In Matthew now, he saw the earthquake and what took place, i.e., look at all these dead people that came back, and they were terrified and said, truly this man was God's son. That one feels like a lot more of a compelling reason to think this individual is the son of God. If I see the way you breathed your last and I suddenly know. Maybe more of a faith perspective in Mark. Matthew, I am looking at all this sequence of events and I go, oh, geez.
It's zombie land here, and
maybe we did something.
We have screwed up royally here. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, it's this guy. So in Mark, it's you're putting the pronouncement into the voice of the opposition, and you're saying, they couldn't see it, but I can see it.
Yeah.
Right. And you have a lot of that in Mark. The disciples can't see, but the blind people can see, right? The disciples can't see, but the Romans can see.
The recognition.
The recognition of who Jesus really is. And here in Matthew, it's like, whoa, boy.
There's a lot of stuff that you should be able to recognize, like the dead people. And the centurion does and has our declaration.
It's Homer Simpson, backing up into the bushes, right? He's like, this we have done. This is Houston, we have a problem type thing. It's bad.
So we have similarities with Mark.
Right.
But some of these moments is where differences start to emerge in the way they're telling the story. We end with the same thing of Joseph of Arimathea, now a disciple of Jesus in Matthew. Mm-hmm. He went to Pilate and asks for the body. So a little bit of an enhancement again here in Matthew, where what level is the connection between? Is he just one of these individuals that is waiting for the kingdom of God? Well, Matthew might provide a little clarification of, and what Mark meant by that potentially is he is a disciple. And so he gets the body, he buries the body. Mary Magdalene and Mary were sitting there again. Right. Curtain down, end of the day.
All right. So is that the same as the Gospel of Mark? Remember, Matthew's most likely, 99% likely, has a copy of Mark sitting in front of him when he's writing his gospel. So he's got Mark, and yet he's embellishing it. He's adding to it.
I can make your story better.
Yeah, let me mark this up a little bit. Hold my beer, right? I can make this better.
Add zombies.
And but that's always, people are always telling us more aliens, please. And it's like, no, we don't add aliens to things. Matthew's like, I got zombies. Zombies.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but that's what he's done. That's what he's doing. And he's also, again, heightening the responsibility of the Jewish leaders, of the Jewish people, and trying to make Rome look even more innocent.
Yeah.
He's just saying this isn't Rome. Now, in all fairness, Josephus is doing the same thing. When you go look at the Jewish War, when you read who Josephus is making responsible for this, Josephus, now keep in mind, Josephus was captured by the Romans, put on the Roman payroll, and so we know his motivation
got some
for doing
biases.
this, right?
Yeah.
He's motivated. Hey, I don't want to upset the Romans, so hey, it was the Jewish zealots. It was the zealots. They were the ones that accidentally burned it down, and it wasn't the Romans' fault, even though the Romans were putting down this rebellion. But it was Josephus is going to blame his own people. So, Josephus isn't beyond doing this as well. But Matthew comes right at it saying the Romans were completely innocent. They had nothing to do with this. They were trying to get out of it, but it was the Jewish leaders who were doing this. It's just a different motivation behind it.
So we roll the clock back again.
Right.
And let's jump into Luke. Because Luke, we have a shift when we're talking about the politics and the political questions. Luke addresses some of that for us here at the beginning. When we jump back to the accusation in Jesus before Pilate, they begin to accuse him. And now we get the description of some of these accusations. Whereas Matthew and Mark are telling us, well, they're saying a bunch of stuff. And Pilate says, what do you have to say about this?
Right.
Luke says they're accusing him, saying, we found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. And then as we go on, they're insistent. He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea and Galilee, where he began, even to this place. So for Luke, why add in, right? We have the accusations. We'd had the accusations before that he's saying to be a Messiah, or they say that you're the king. Taxes and perverting our nation.
In the Gospel of Luke, you're going to get more technical and you're going to get more political. So you're going to see a couple of things. So if you're the Messiah, tell us. And then Jesus answers with this ambiguous, you will see the Son of Man. Again, he refers to himself in the third person with this ambiguous derivative of Aramaic, right? You will see the Son of Man, it means a person, but it also is a loaded term for some kind of messianic individual, seated at the right hand of power of God. Okay, thanks. You didn't really answer the question. Are you the Son of God? Well, you say that I am. So apparently that tradition is there. And then they're going to come in and say, he's perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor.
Taxes.
Now you're talking dirty, right? Now you're playing hardball. And saying that he's the Messiah. I don't care. A king. Oh, so Luke is going to try to get these opponents of Jesus, these Jewish leaders, to not only say things against the Jewish religion, but to spin them so that they're also against Rome. Mm-hmm. And that's what's going to get Pilate's attention.
And the inclusion here in the difference with Luke is also this Galilee.
Right.
Which then Pilate's ears pick up and he says, oh, he's a Galilean. Okay, Herod's problem.
Right.
Enter Herod. Herod had not been a part, according to Mark and Matthew.
Right.
And so Jesus gets sent off to go visit Herod, who, according to Luke, was very glad, for he'd been wanting to see him for a long time because he'd heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. And so we have the Herod questioning as well.
And this is the beauty of Luke's gospel is we have to recall that Pilate and Herod Antipas have a rivalry as well. So not only does Pilate and the Jewish leadership have a rivalry, they don't trust each other, but they have to work together, right? They do, because if the Jewish high priesthood gets upset, they can write to Tiberius and have him removed. But if these guys don't play ball, he can, make life really hard for the Jewish high priesthood. So they're always feeling each other out. There's this political rivalry back and forth. But the same is true between Pilate and Herod Antipas. Because remember, Herod Antipas, one of Herod the Great's sons, they all wanted to take over for Herod the Great. Herod the Great killed a bunch of his sons, and when he died, they split up his kingdom between Archelaus, Philip, and Herod Antipas. And Archelaus got recalled. And so Antipas is like, well, I'm next in line. I'll take over the kingdom. And they said, no, we're just going to take his part that Antipas wanted, Jerusalem, Judea, and we're going to give it under direct Roman governorship. And he's like, no, that's my throne. That's my kingdom. That's my father's kingdom. And you're going to give it to these guys. And Pilate's the guy who's now sitting on his father's throne, Antipas's father's throne, King Herod's throne, and living over in his father's palace over in Caesarea Maritima. So Antipas is up in the Galilee, that place that they all make fun of, right? You're Galilean, we can tell by the accent, right? Antipas is relegated up here, and Pilate is sitting in his father's throne, the land that he wanted. They do not like each other. So when Jesus is brought before Pilate and they said, oh, wait, he's from Galilee? Yeah.
That's a different problem.
Yeah, go send him to Antipas. We'll let him deal with it. And you guys can deal with Tiberius and Antipas, right? So Pilate sees this as put him up there. You guys deal with him.
Well, and Luke does provide, because you hear this and you go, wait a minute. They're with Pilate in Jerusalem, Herod, Galilee. You're telling me that they get him up there and back? Luke adds the detail. Conveniently, Herod is in Jerusalem at that time.
And why is that? Two things that Luke makes a point. One, we know from Josephus, so we know from extra biblical accounts that John the Baptist had an open rift with Antipas. Remember, Antipas has divorced his wife and married his brother's wife, and John the Baptist was all over him about that. So there's this and then Antipas was the one who had John the Baptist's head cut off.
His head.
Right. So is it possible that Antipas sees Jesus as what? The second coming of John the Baptist? Does he see him as another one of these? He's clearly intrigued by him. But remember, it's also the Passover. And Antipas has to honor this. So he's coming into town for the festival. And so he's right there. So it's not like he's got to send him way up. He's just it's not my problem. Send him to Antipas. He's clearly Galilean. So Pilate is basically getting rid of two problems at once. I can send him over to Antipas and make this Antipas's problem. And I don't have to deal with these Jewish leaders. And I'll set a trap for Antipas. I'll get rid of these Jewish guys. Problem solved.
And it doesn't quite work because Herod does the questioning. Jesus gives no answer. We got our Mark Jesus showing back up.
Right.
But then they do the mockery. They put the robe on. They send him back. And then Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they'd been enemies, which is that line to talk about, hey, I as the author of Luke, or we as the hands responsible for Luke, know about this backstory, that there was a rift that you just talked about. And look, somehow both of them questioning this individual has solved this relationship. The rift is healed because they both get to be a part of this.
And I think this goes back to that notion, that later notion, that Antipas, while Jewish, is working for Rome.
Yeah.
And Pilate is working on behalf of Rome. And so if we don't work together against these guys, or at least pool our efforts, we're going to have a problem with this, because these guys can control the crowds. And if these guys start complaining, we're both going to have a problem, because they already don't like you, Antipas, because you've gone to them before and tried to get all of this and we're told no. And I already have a problem because they've already appealed to me and had me shut down. So we need to work together, even though you don't like me and I don't like you. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. We need to work together against these Jewish leaders, which is very convenient, by the way, for the text, because now the text can put all of the blame on the Jewish religious authorities, and Rome
can come out pretty clean.
Didn't have anything to do with the death of Jesus.
So Jesus gets sent back to Pilate. Right. He comes forward to the people and says, I've examined him. So has Herod.
Right.
And we find him, both of us, nothing deserving of death.
Right.
I will therefore have him flogged and release him. So fine, you don't like him. We'll rough him up a bit.
Right.
And we'll let him go. And they shout out, release Barabbas for us. A man who'd been put in prison for insurrection and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. So already one attempt to say, let this guy go. Pilate comes out again. They keep crying, crucify, crucify. A third time he said to them, Luke, like really driving it home, Pilate wants to let him out. And it's the people who keep saying, crucify him. Their voices prevailed. Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted.
So he finally gives in, but only after it is made abundantly clear that it's the Jewish authorities and the Jewish people who are the ones that are going to be responsible for the death of Jesus.
Luke.
It ain't me.
Luke does a lot to try to get Pilate off the hook, send him to Herod.
Correct.
Herod sends him back. Both of us find him innocent. I go out again, and a third time, and still he gives into the people's voice. I think drawing, not to harmonize all of them together, but in the context we talked about with Mark and the fear of rebellions of, I'm really trying. If you are so dead set on this individual dying, is this a we'll bear our necks again?
Right.
And so fine,
It's you asked once, you asked twice, but now that you've asked 3 times, it's on you.
You can have it.
I'm going to grant it.
And so they handed over Jesus as they wished. And we get the march towards crucifixion. Jesus now, on the way to the crucifixion, has a moment of speech, which we haven't had before. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. The day will come where they say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.
Yeah, now all of a sudden Jesus catches his breath and he's going to get pretty talky.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're moving along, 2 criminals again.
Right.
And now this is the version that I think people are starting to get to more of, what do we expect the criminals to be doing? Because before, again, it's just been the 2, and they participate in the mockery. Luke gives us that, there's 2, and one of them is mocking him.
Right.
And then it's the other one that is, do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And then the truly, you'll be with me in paradise.
Right.
Why a change here? Because we have now 2 traditions where it is, they are participating in the mockery.
Right.
And Luke bringing in one of them as the recognition.
Right. I think a couple of things happen. We have to remember that Matthew adds this thing about the titulus, right? The king of the Jews.
Yeah.
And so they're adding this mockery that the high priest doesn't like, right? No, don't put that up there. And it's like, hey, you're accusing him of the king of the Jews. We're going to put that he's the king of the Jews. That's your words, not mine. So Pilate puts that up there. Luke continues this up there, right?
Well, and John really
in John, we'll come back to it in John, but there's this, but you also get this thing where if I'm an author and let's say I'm making it up. I'm not saying that he's making it up, but if I'm an author, I'm saying, how else can I testify to the innocence of Jesus? And is there anyone else that should be the opposition to Jesus that I can get to turn and praise Jesus? We already did the Roman soldier. So the only other person that's in this story is one of the criminals, right? So maybe they change it 2 other criminals that implies Jesus was a criminal, and you can have 2 others which happen to be criminals, and one of them now is saying, no. This guy was innocent. You're guilty. We're both guilty. We both deserve what we're getting, but this guy was innocent. And Jesus turns to him and says, you're going to be with me in paradise, which happens to be in the same gospel, the Gospel of Luke, where you get, for instance, the story of rich man and Lazarus, another story where as soon as Lazarus dies, he's in heaven. So it's none of this resurrection, dying, and then one day you will be raised. It's today you will be with me in paradise, this immediacy of going to heaven. So you've got the resurrection theme, but you've also got in Luke, the immediacy into heaven.
Yeah.
Is it Luke trying to sneak in one of these immediacy into heaven tropes? Is it Luke using this as an opportunity to get one other person that we didn't expect to speak to Jesus' innocence? This is the person, right?
Well, in Luke shifts, the centurion is still present,
right.
But in Luke, the centurion doesn't do this man is the Son of God, but instead, certainly this man was innocent.
Correct.
And so we have kind of a swapping here where
Correct.
The criminal is now the one saying, hey, do you not fear God? Implication being this individual is, and the centurion now is the one saying, I'm not making the claim,
right,
but I'm saying that this individual is innocent.
Right.
So a bit of a shuffling of the deck.
Right.
We come away with a similar result, but Luke is changing some of the sequences that we have in this.
And again, Jesus is still talking this whole time, right? He's into your hands I commit my spirit. He's daughters of Jerusalem. You have all of these, Father, forgive them.
Yeah.
Right. So Jesus is very talky when compared to Mark, right? So when we talk about these sayings of Jesus from the cross, they're not coming from Mark, right? They're with the exception of the Elo lama sabachthani, right? You're getting them in these other gospels.
Jesus has some time to kill in Luke's gospel. Bored, carrying the cross. I'm like, I'm doing this. That doesn't mean I can't talk to you.
Right.
I'm on the cross. Let's have some conversations. An interesting switch,
Right.
seems to be well composed. All of
Right.
them being crucified are rather well composed for the state that
Correct. They're given their speeches.
they're given their death speeches.
Right.
So
Which is what, by the way, when we read about, you see it in the old movies, and they're dying and they're giving some death speech and you're like, just die, right? Modern movies, they just die quickly because that's more realistic. In antiquity and even up through the movies in, the 50s and 60s, and you were supposed to give an elaborate death speech. You were
the final words.
Yeah, your final word. Well, you're supposed to give an elaborate speech. And so we have this in all the Greek literature. We have this in all great literature had some final speech. Josephus, look at the speeches that he probably made up. And these, the final speech at Masada, right? This is this noble speech. So this is probably what we're getting, the final words. They're not big, long, elaborate speeches, but Jesus gets to say something before he dies. And here we're getting it in Luke. So this is standard, typical ancient literature for a death scene.
And Jesus dies.
Mm-hmm.
Temple curtain is torn. We don't get any zombies in Luke's version, right? That stays with Mark.
Right.
Joseph of Arimathea, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. So somewhere in between the Mark version and the Matthew version, a part of that council, yes, expecting the kingdom, not maybe the disciple that Matthew is telling us about,
Right.
but here telling us, not a part of this plan to do the crucifixion. Goes to Pilate, gets the body, prepares the body.
Yeah, maybe he was a dissenting voice. Maybe he got voted down. Maybe, we don't know. Maybe he wasn't there. Maybe he voted present or
he abstained from the vote potentially.
Abstained.
So Joseph of Arimathea is still there, but again, this shifting characterization for him as
Correct.
an individual that's connected to a very important moment here, the burial.
Right.
That one of these details you would think we could be on the same page about of how does Jesus get buried and by who
Right.
and what's the relationship? Curtain down, Joseph buries him,
Mm-hmm.
whatever his relationship is. And then we'll go to John, our last one.
Right.
John, one
John.
pass
It's
through.
John. It's John.
I mean, John, you like Mark. I really like John. Like the reading through,
John's beautiful.
John adds a lot of things in. And so if we jump back now, we're with Pilate again.
Okay.
And Pilate goes out to them, asks, what accusations do you have? They answer, if this man were not a criminal, would we have handed him over to you?
The rhetorical question.
Surely you know he's going to be guilty. We wouldn't be wasting your time.
Right.
Pilate says, judge him according to your law. They say we're not permitted to put anyone to death. John is being explicit about the stuff some of the others implied, like, they can't kill him.
Right.
John says, maybe you don't know this, but I'm going to tell you.
Right.
They need him to do this.
Yeah. I always like when he starts talking back to Pilate as well, right?
John gives Jesus a lot more screen time with Pilate.
Yeah, and Jesus is, in Mark, he was just, you said so, right? Are you the king of the Jews? Well, you said so. And then he just does the silent thing. He invokes his Fifth Amendment, and he just, not that they had it, but he just sits there quietly, and therefore he can't be convicted of anything, right? He didn't answer. But in John, Jesus is kind of popping off back. He's becoming a philosopher.
Yeah, definitely philosopher-ish with the what is truth, because we get Pilate doing the, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus replies, do you ask this or did others tell you?
Is this your question or are these guys telling you to ask this? And if I'm Pilate, I'm like, wait. Nobody tells me what to do. And Jesus is already under his skin.
Yeah.
Right?
And Pilate responds, your own nation, your chief priests, again pushing towards, they're the ones responsible. Jesus, my kingdom is not of this world.
Right.
If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here.
Yeah. And then he goes, so you're a king, right? So is that what you're saying? So he's trying to be prosecuting attorney. So you said king, so you're a king. And he said, wait, you said that I'm a king. And for this reason I was born, and I came into the world to testify to the truth. And everyone who belongs to the truth is going to listen to my voice. And Pilate's like, quit talking in circles. You answer my question. So then he's going to give it back to him. He's like, what is truth?
A significantly expanded.
Yeah, no, and so now he's like, what is truth? So now he wants to have you want to have a philosophical debate? Let's have a philosophical debate. I can do this. Right? I read a little of my own history and my little own philosophy. I was trained a little bit. I'm equestrian, but okay. And he gets into this, and the chief priests are over there just going, come on. No, this isn't what we're here for. Pilate is trying to show that he can hold his own with a very verbal Jesus, as opposed to Mark, where he's just peppering him questions. And so you get two different takes, here Jesus, giving him some back. And Pilate's like, yeah, that's fine. We'll do it. It doesn't help. It doesn't help what the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders are there to do.
And we don't get the version from Luke, which is let me give very political explanations for why this needs to be happening. John leans into John's trend, which is this, the philosophical side.
From outer space.
What's over there?
And philosophy and.
Yeah, so Pilate does the what is truth. And then we just get after he said this, he went out to the Jews and said, I find no case. Yeah. So we don't get the full description of whatever dialogue they have about what truth is.
He's a smart aleck, but he didn't do anything wrong. He's just a professor, and you get sick of him. He's a teacher, right? You get sick of these guys, but they're asking questions and they're telling you stuff, and I don't want to talk to them anymore either. But
let me go out and talk to the people.
Yeah, but you can't kill them for it, right?
Yeah, which is what he says.
Right.
I find no case. We have the custom I release. Do you want? And he doesn't call him Jesus. He says, do you want the king of the Jews? They say no, but Barabbas. And so it's just like, fine, that's who you want. That's what you're going to do. Pilate went out. I'm bringing him out to you. I find no case against him. Right. He went out wearing the crown. They say, crucify him. Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case. We have a law. According to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Pilate hears this and he's more afraid. So we do get some of okay, I'm not going all the way the Luke way of get him out, get him out, get him out.
Right.
But somewhere in between, where it's still shifting things back to the people, the Son of God part gets Pilate a little bit afraid. Mm-hmm. And then Pilate tries to release in verse 12, if you release this man, you're no friend to the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. And that seems to be the ticking over point in John.
This is dirty, right? So this is when according to John, this is, I think, in my mind, just as bad as when you have in Matthew, his blood be on us and on our hands. But you have it being done in a political way, okay? You've got Pilate here saying, look, I don't find anything against him. You guys take him yourselves and crucify him. And that's when he's telling the Jewish leadership, he's saying, you guys, if that's what you wanted, I said he's innocent. I'm not going to crucify him. You take him yourself and do it. Knowing that as soon as they do that, he's going to round them all up for doing something that only Rome can sanction. So he's like, you go do it, but I'm either going to bust you for carrying out an execution, or you're going to have to deal with all the people because I didn't sanction this. You did it, and the people are going to come after you. So he gives it back to the high priest. He gives it back to the Jewish leadership, and they're like, oh God, he's got us. So then they go nuclear, and they go to Pilate and they say, if you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. You're no friend of the emperor, right? Anyone who claims to be a king, even a king of the Jews, sets himself against the emperor. And that's a threat. Mm-hmm. That is a threat. They're basically telling Pilate, if you let this guy go, we're going to go to the emperor. Remember, you have lost your support in Tiberius's court. You don't have, I think his name, Sejanus, or I forget, but this guy's dead. In fact, Tiberius had him killed. Okay? So your benefactor there in Jerusalem your benefactor in Rome is gone. So if we give yet another bad report about you, there's a chance you don't survive. Mm-hmm. And if we say that you let go somebody who was claiming to be king, that was, this is treason, right? This is insurrection, and you let him go, they're at the very least going to recall you and hold a tribunal. Right? They're going to hold an investigation, and we're going to come testify.
Yeah.
You're host. You have to do this. We're going to force your hand on this. So that's what's going on here. This is a threat. The Jewish establishment is like, don't you try to back us into a corner. We're going to tell the emperor that you let an insurrectionist go.
So taking some of that material from Luke, but shifting the deployment of it.
They're openly threatening Pilate right here. If you release this man, you're no friend of an emperor, and anyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. And Pilate must have been furious, but he knows he's trapped.
Yeah, because then he comes out, he sits on the stone, the judgment stone.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I crucify your king?
Mm-hmm.
They answer, we have no king but the emperor. He handed him over to be crucified. So still returning to that, what do you want to do? And they drive it again one more time.
Yeah. And he says, shall I crucify your king? So he's trying to trap them back. This is your king. And they say, we have no king but the emperor. And again, is this the author, or is this a later edition trying to put into the text this, we have no king but the emperor, basically having the Jewish authorities saying, we don't serve God, we serve the emperor of Rome, right? It makes the Jewish religious establishment look very bad. We only serve Rome, right? We're willing to blaspheme ourselves, right? We're willing to say that Rome is our emperor in order to get this guy killed. It's a very, very bad look. This whole thing is a bad turn here in the Gospel of John. So the question, we always look at that verse from Matthew, his blood be on us and our children. But this here is the threat against the emperor. And then when he comes back and he tries to trap him back, they're like, no, we only serve the emperor. And Pilate's like, all right, go.
Well, and he gets him one more time with this one, because John has Jesus carry the cross himself, no cross bearer for him. But then John adds this description for the sign. The chief priests come to Pilate and say, do not write the king of the Jews, but this man said, I am king of the Jews. And Pilate says, I have written what I have written.
Right.
Like returning again to this one of you said this. And they want to do, no. Don't say that we said it.
Right.
Say that he said it. Come on, that's not.
Pilate's like, screw you guys. You guys forced me to do this. You guys threatened me. You guys, this is the sign. So why are we crucifying this guy? He claimed to be king of the Jews. You said,
yes,
this is what so that's the
sign.
I'm not going to put these guys said or he said.
Let me put a paragraph on here.
Let me put 3 footnotes and a disclaimer. King of the Jews. And so now these guys have to watch these chief priests, these Jewish priests have to watch this guy be crucified as the king of the, which is humiliating to them. So Pilate is doing one last dig back at them, saying, you're making me do this, you're going to eat this. They hate each other.
We've got a lot more back and forth between these groups in John. Like comparing this with Mark, where the narrative just kind of moves ahead event to event.
Right.
We have the back and forth between Jesus and Pilate and the dialogues. We have the back and forth between the people and Pilate here. We're getting a much more movie-like scene as we're moving through John's version in ways that continue this apologetic for Pilate of moving him to one side of the guilty or innocent conversation and the people to another.
Right.
So Jesus is crucified, right? We have that scene that comes through. We have with the 2 individuals. And then we have a significant change here in 1931. Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. So they do this. They come to Jesus. They see he's already dead. They pierce his side. Blood and water comes out. And then we get this is so these things of Scripture might be fulfilled.
Right.
The only one where we get this story about the leg breaking and the side puncturing. But the Jews are coming back again to Pilate with, hey, we got another request for you. We got a request. Why is this request showing up in John and not in the others if the events are taking place in the similar time period that we have them making petitions?
You have this story of, Jesus was talking a lot more. He says some other things, by the way, here. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, and again, in verse 30, he says it's finished, and then he gives up his spirit. Now, people who study Gnostic traditions and try to throw Gnostic parallels within John's gospel because of the kind of language he uses, they seize on this gave up his spirit. And the Gnostic Christianity, right? His spirit left him before he died.
Yeah.
Right. So they seize on this. And the other point being that he died so easily, both in Mark, he died so quickly without saying a lot. And then here, right, he dies before everyone else does. So that wasn't a struggle. I've heard it said he's basically willing himself. He's willingly going to die because he knows there's a mission, or he knows but one way or the other, Jesus is already gone. And so how do you know he's really dead? How do you know that he's not just passed out or unconscious? You have this tradition which becomes the tradition of the Holy Spear, the Holy Lance, or the Spear of Destiny. I've done several documentaries. We talk about the Spear of Destiny. So you get the crown of thorns, you get the Holy Spear, you obviously get the wood of the cross and the nails of the cross. All these objects are being affiliated with Jesus at his death, just to make sure that he's dead. Why? They got to get him down off the cross before the Sabbath starts.
So they're returning to some of these in the dialogue of John, giving space for more of this back and forth of, okay, we're not just going to have Joseph of Arimathea going to Pilate to ask for the body.
Right.
We have them going to say, hey, can we make sure that these individuals, die a little bit faster?
Right.
Because crucifixion isn't a quick process.
Right. No, it's days.
Can we make sure that they're dead so we can do this? So Jesus dies. Joseph of Arimathea does go. Here we have a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one, because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take the body away. And another character, Nicodemus, is present for this as well. But Joseph of Arimathea here, not described as a member of the council, but a disciple again, secretly, because of the fear of, some of the who...
And this gets harmonized, obviously, with the other Gospels, so that you end up having Joseph of Arimathea being on the Sanhedrin, being on the council, and maybe voting for it, but maybe abstaining from the vote, but also being a secret disciple of Jesus, or maybe just being a Jesus sympathizer, or maybe just wanting to give him a dignified death, and maybe going to Pilate and asking for it, or maybe going to Pilate with other... You have this, but you can see how he's treated in these 4 different Gospels. He's basically a different character in all 4 different Gospels. And then Nicodemus pops up. Yeah, so he had a buddy.
By the way, there's another guy.
Right.
It helps to carry a body and to bury a body if there's more than one individual doing this.
Because you also had the women there.
Yeah.
You also have these other, and then John.
So that's the end of John.
Right.
Jesus dead, buried.
Right.
There's all 4. A bit of a longer walk through with all of these, but I think worth taking the time to see how they walk down different paths with some of these, at times, small details, at times, significant details, some different problematic aspects that come through in all of these.
It's an important exercise to do, because just like with the nativity scenes, we tend to, we put the shepherds and the magi there together. We tend to blend these stories together when the one thing we know for certain is that's not what happened. We know that there are 2 distinct stories. We know that the 2 different authors are emphasizing different things. Here we have this significant event and 4 different authors telling us 4 different things. And so I think this is an important exercise to do. I'm thankful to everybody who's tuned in and who's watching, because it's an important exercise to see what the individual gospel authors are emphasizing and why they're emphasizing these specific things. Maybe one of them wants to say something more about the Romans. Maybe they're saying something more about Pilate. Maybe they want to take in a dig about Antipas, right? That's what's going on here. And then once you realize the differences between the 4 Gospels, you can learn that much more about the actual last day of Jesus.
And it opens up more of the conversation about the political background. What's happening in Rome? Is that a concern? Is that not? Why fear the people rising up? All of these things come out a little bit more when you start to put them in conversation with each other.
If you don't flatten it all down and harmonize it together and you read them distinctly, you have a better understanding of the context of what was going on in the first century.
Well, Bob, thank you for taking the time to walk through.
Thank you. This was great.
All of these. If you have questions that we didn't get to in this, because inevitably we skipped over a lot of verses. There's a lot of material here. We're long as we are already. Thanks for staying with us, because I think it's worth the extra time to go through this. If you have questions, send us an email, put it in the comments, let us know, because there's more parts here that we could come back to in the future. But for today, we're going to leave it there. Jesus dead and buried, and that's where we're closing the last day of Jesus, depending on what you might want to say happens after that. So we're going to leave Jesus there for today.
For now.
For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. For Bob, I'm Jordan. Until next time.